Title: The Midnight Caller. Samantha Jones had always considered herself lucky to find her new apartment. Nestled in a quiet corner of the city, it was everything she wanted: cozy, affordable, and away from the noise of downtown. The first few weeks in her new home were peaceful. She enjoyed the solitude, the evenings with a good book, and the occasional friendly wave from her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Allen, who lived just down the hall. It was a Thursday night when the first phone call came. Samantha was in the middle of brushing her teeth, ready to settle into bed, when the sharp ring of the phone echoed through her small apartment. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. Who would be calling at this hour? Wiping her mouth with a towel, she picked up the phone. "Hello?" she answered, her voice cautious. There was no reply, just silence. Samantha listened closely, trying to detect any background noise. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic breathing on the other end. "Hello? Who is this?" she repeated, but there was no answer. The line went dead. Samantha shrugged it off as a wrong number, maybe even a prank. She set the phone back in its cradle and went to bed, her mind dismissing the incident as she drifted off to sleep. The next night, just as she was about to turn off the lights, the phone rang again. Startled, she glanced at the clock. Midnight, on the dot. A chill ran down her spine as she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said, trying to sound assertive. Again there was silence, followed by the same eerie breathing. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded. But the line went dead again. This time, she couldn't shake the feeling of unplugging the phone from the wall, hoping to avoid another disturbance. But the calls didn't stop. Night after night, always at midnight, the phone would ring. Samantha started to dread the sound, her sleep disrupted by the relentless calls. She reported the number to her phone company, but they couldn't trace the calls. She even went to the police, but they told her there was nothing they could do unless the caller made a direct threat. One night, after almost 2 weeks of sleepless nights, Samantha decided to confront whoever was behind the calls. She sat in her darkened living room, the phone in her lap, watching the clock tick closer to midnight. As the clock struck 12, the phone rang. Samantha took a deep breath and picked up the receiver. "Listen," she said firmly. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but this has to stop. You're scaring me." For a moment there was silence, and then a low, raspy voice whispered, "I'm watching you." Samantha's blood ran cold. She slammed the phone down and immediately called the police. They arrived quickly, checking her apartment and the surrounding area, but found no sign of anyone. The officers assured her they would patrol the area, but Samantha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The calls stopped for a few days, and Samantha began to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But one night, as she was preparing dinner, there was a knock at her door. She froze, a knife in her hand, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. Samantha slowly approached the door and peered through the peephole. It was Mrs. Allen. Relieved, Samantha opened the door. "Oh, Mrs. Allen, you scared me," she said with a nervous laugh. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Allen replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard noises and wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine, just a bit on edge. I've been getting these strange phone calls," Samantha confessed, feeling a bit embarrassed. Mrs. Allen's eyes widened with concern. "Oh, that sounds awful. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call me, day or night," she offered kindly. "Thank you, Mrs. Allen. I really appreciate it," Samantha replied, feeling a little better after their conversation. The next night, the phone rang again at midnight. Samantha's heart sank as she picked up the receiver. "Who is this?" she demanded. The voice on the other end chuckled softly. "You shouldn't have ignored me," it whispered. "I'm closer than you think." Then the line went dead. Terrified, Samantha called the police again, but they found nothing unusual. The officers suggested she stay with a friend or family member for a few days, but Samantha was determined not to be driven out of her own home. Over the next few days, Samantha became increasingly paranoid. She kept her curtains closed, checked every door and window multiple times, and jumped at every little sound. She even started sleeping with a baseball bat next to her bed, just in case. One evening, as she was locking up her apartment, she noticed a shadow moving in the hallway. Her heart raced as she strained to see who it was, but the shadow quickly disappeared. She closed and locked the door, pressing her back against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was sure now, someone was watching her. A few nights later, the phone rang again at midnight. This time, Samantha decided to stay silent, hoping the caller would speak first. The breathing on the other end was heavier now, almost frantic. After what felt like an eternity, the voice whispered, "I'm inside the building." Samantha's blood turned to ice. She hung up the phone and quickly checked her door. It was locked, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She grabbed the baseball bat and stood in the middle of her living room, waiting for anything to happen. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on her door. "Samantha, open up! It's Mrs. Allen!" A voice called out, urgent and scared. Samantha hesitated, gripping the bat tightly. "Please hurry," Mrs. Allen pleaded. Samantha opened the door a crack, peering out into the hallway. Mrs. Allen stood there, looking terrified. "What's going on?" Samantha asked, her voice shaky. "I saw someone lurking around," Mrs. Allen said, her voice trembling. "I think they were watching your apartment." Samantha's heart raced. She stepped back, letting Mrs. Allen in, and locked the door behind her. "What should we do?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. "We need to call the police," Mrs. Allen suggested. Samantha nodded and reached for the phone, but before she could dial, the phone rang again. She stared at it, her hand hovering over the receiver. "Don't answer it," Mrs. Allen warned, her voice suddenly cold. Samantha hesitated, then slowly picked up the receiver. "Hello," she whispered. The voice on the other end was no longer raspy, it was clear and chilling. "Samantha," Mrs. Allen's voice said through the phone, "you shouldn't have let me in." Samantha turned to Mrs. Allen, her eyes wide with horror. Mrs. Allen smiled, a sinister grin spreading across her face. "It's too late now," she whispered, her voice matching the one on the phone. The door to Samantha's apartment suddenly swung open, and two masked figures rushed in. Samantha screamed and tried to run, but one of the intruders grabbed her, pinning her against the wall. "Good job, Mrs. Allen," one of the intruders said, removing his mask to reveal a young man with a cruel smile. "I knew you'd get her to trust you." Mrs. Allen nodded, her kind, elderly demeanor replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "She was too easy," she replied, "just like the others." Samantha struggled, fear gripping her as she realized the truth. The calls, the stalking, it was all part of their twisted game. She had been their target from the beginning. As the intruders tied her up, Samantha's mind raced, searching for a way out. She knew she had to stay calm and think clearly if she wanted to survive. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Because we can," the young man replied with a shrug, "and because it's fun." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the nightmare was far from over. She knew she had to find a way to escape, but for now, all she could do was wait and hope for a chance to break free from the horrors that awaited her in the darkness.